All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our February History in Our Backyard webinar. My name is Eleanor Rangers, and I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We're celebrating our 13th year in preserving history through the memories of those who created it. So thank you for joining again this evening. And again, this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series. And just a general reminder for those that are on, most of the people I recognize that are on the webinar this evening, but I do prefer if you can put, just as a reminder for future notice, that if you can put your full name on your identifier when you enter, that would be helpful to make sure that I'm letting all the right people in who do want to legitimately participate. So thank you for your help with that. I do also want to mention that we are a 501c3 organization, a very modest organization with very modest needs. However, if you do so choose, we would very much appreciate your consideration when you are thinking about donations to organizations like ourselves. And those donations are always appreciated and go directly to the historical preservation efforts that we're involved in. For example, we are in the process, which I have mentioned on some previous webinars, of assembling a display room at what was the old Johnsville Centrifuge building, now an event center known as the Fuge in Warminster, Pennsylvania. We are in the planning stages for this, hoping to roll out the initial displays sometime towards mid-year, and definitely looking forward to that. And certainly we could use some assistance with monies that are going to help me with framing and creating signage and so forth for some of the items that will be in the display room. So just something to think about, again, if you do so choose to make a donation. I do also want to remind you that we do maintain a YouTube channel under the name of this organization. We do add content and update content there regularly. We will also house this webinar on that site following the conclusion of this event this evening. We also do have a Facebook page as well. So if you are on that social media platform, feel free to check us out. Notice, however, the name is a little different, Southeastern PA, not Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society, but that is us. And we do try to post some Cold War related items of interest on there, as well as advertising for our events as well. But you can also access our main webpage at coldwarhistory.org for information and on our organization, some of the other things that we're involved in, and our events page is on there, and most importantly, a donation button as well. Also want to give a plug for the Fuge has a number of event sites, and something that recently opened last year was a brewery and pub, actually known as Tranquility Brewing Company. They actually make their own beer, and they do have quite a number of events there. So they are becoming pretty, starting to get more known in the local Warminster area. I've had a chance to dine there. It's a lovely little place and great food, so would encourage you to definitely check that out. And I also do want to mention that we are going to be restarting our movie nights. For those of you who have been attending programming for a number of years, just prior to the pandemic, we did our first movie night. We had Gary Powers Jr. there for a Q&A following a viewing of Bridge of Spies. But I've been keeping a list of Cold War movies all through the pandemic, and I think it is time to start reinitiating our movie night. Details to come possibly as early as next month, but I'm planning on something probably in mid-May. So more details. I'm pretty excited about this offering, but I don't want to spoil the surprise yet. So more to come. I do try to mute anyone who comes on who may accidentally not have their microphones muted, but if you could remain muted and have your cameras off during the presentation, that helps to preserve bandwidth for the benefit of our presenter. We have circulated our 2023 webinar schedule. This is what we have currently planned. I do want to make note that in May, we've had a switch in our topic. The individual who was going to talk about TACAMO was unable to commit to that. So actually, I'm pretty fortunate to know a gentleman who can talk about electronic warfare countermeasures with the Navy. He was involved with that for a long time, and I think still is. So Bud Holloway will be presenting in May on that topic. And we've actually just added an additional lecture in December. Actually, David Stumpf, who started out the year talking about missile impact location systems, is going to come back with another topic on the Minuteman, this time talking about vulnerability with the Minuteman system. So he always is a wealth of information about our nuclear arsenal. So I'm looking forward to rounding out the year with his presentation. And next month, on March 9th, we are delighted to actually have Stephen Walker giving a talk about his book that was published last year about Yuri Gagarin. I have to tell you, I'm in the process of listening to the audiobook, and it's really a fantastic book. Would highly recommend if reading it, or at least getting the audiobook. Very enjoyable. And I think fleshes out a lot more of the humanity behind the Russian program, which is kind of nice because, of course, we know a lot about our Project Mercury astronauts, but it's an interesting sort of yin yang going back and forth between the U.S. developments and the Russian developments, of course, leading up to Gagarin's flight in April of '61. So looking forward to that next month. And just a couple other slides, and I'm going to then introduce our speaker this evening. But I guess the inspiration for Beverly, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Beverly, but certainly Rosemary Mariner is a key person that will be discussed this evening, and really, I think maybe started it all from a Navy female aviation standpoint. For those of you who don't know her, she was one of the first 8 women selected for military pilot training in 1973. And she was the first woman to ever solo in a Navy tactical jet. She also is one of the first women to serve on a Navy warship and earned surface warfare officer qualification. And she became the first woman to command an aviation squadron. So she did have quite an illustrious career, and you will be learning more about her in a moment. I also want to mention, speaking of other women's aviation firsts, when we all watch the Super Bowl this weekend, and of course, for those who are Philly fans, go Eagles. During halftime, there is going to be a Super Bowl flyover to honor 50 years of women in naval aviation, 1973 to 2023. So something to look forward to, in addition to the Eagles' second win in the Super Bowl coming up this weekend. And also, for those of you who may not know, I believe this had kind of made the news over the last summer, but Lieutenant Amanda Stalin Lee is the first woman Blue Angels jet demo pilot. I will also let Beverly tell you a little bit more about her upcoming debut at an air show very soon. So without further ado, let's introduce our guest speaker this evening, Beverly Weintraub. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and instrument-rated private pilot herself. As an editorial writer for the New York Daily News, she covered topics including education, social services, and aviation, and she shared the 2007 Pulitzer for editorial writing for an in-depth investigation into the illnesses afflicting World Trade Center rescue and recovery workers after 9/11. Her op-eds about women in aviation have appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Daily News. And Bev holds tailwheel, complex, and high-performance airplane endorsements and has crisscrossed the country in single-engine propeller aircraft, and she lives in New York City. So I am going to stop my presentation, allow her to take over the controls, and we will get going here. So Beverly, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, and thank you all for having me. As Eleanor said, I am a journalist and a pilot. Right now I work at the 74, which is an education news website. but I've written about women in aviation for the Washington Post and the Daily News, and that's how I came to write the book. And Wings of Gold is especially timely right now for a couple of reasons that Eleanor already mentioned. First of all, this year marks 50 years of women in naval aviation. And the women in my book were those original pioneers. They were the first women officially, the first official female military pilots since the WASP, which I'll talk about a little later, were technically civilians. The second reason is the Super Bowl flyover commemorating 50 years of women in naval aviation. That will be a theme at air shows and other Navy events throughout the year, including at the Super Bowl. Also, Amanda Lee's debut as the first female demo pilot for the Blue Angels, which will be happening at El Centro Naval Air Station in Southern California on March 11th. And the women in my book are planning a huge turnout for her, and I'll be going as well, which will be amazing. And the other hook was the Top Gun sequel that came out last year. Now, if you remember the original Top Gun movie, the little card at the beginning said, "Only the best men get to go to Top Gun." Well, the sequel said, "The best men and women get to go to Top Gun." But, you know, women weren't just handed that opportunity. They had to fight for it. And the book tells the story of how that happened. Now, my involvement in the story dates to 2019 when Captain Rosemary Mariner passed away of ovarian cancer. She was the first woman to solo a Navy tactical jet, the first to command an aviation squadron, and an inspiring leader in promoting equal opportunity for women in the military. Now, at her funeral, the Navy did the first all-women missing man flyover, and that tribute made national news. So every once in a while, a former colleague of mine at the Washington Post, who knows I'm a pilot, will email me if something happens about women in airplanes and say, "Hey, would you write something?" So when the flyover happened, I got an email from her that would I want to write something about the flyover? And I did. And then a couple months later, I was contacted by an editor at Lyons Press who said she thought the story might make for an interesting book. What did I think? And that really doesn't happen for a publisher to ask an author to write, and certainly an author who's never written a book before. So the story found me, and I absolutely couldn't say no. Now, Captain Mariner was one of 6 women who were the first to win Navy Wings of Gold in this experimental program that began in 1973. They were the subjects of tremendous publicity at the start of their careers and with every milestone. And in a moment, you'll see part of a promotional film from 1974 titled "Ladies Wear the Blue." It was a half-hour pitch to recruit women into the Navy. And the very last segment, the capper to the whole thing, was highlighted the brand new flight training program that was just open to women. So you'll see a little bit of their training regimen, footage of the first solo by a woman of a Navy aircraft. And unfortunately, as with some of the other photos I found doing the research for the book, the only prints of this film are in absolutely terrible condition. So I apologize in advance for the poor video and sound quality. Eleanor, are you able to run that, the first video?
I can do that. Just give me a moment to share screen again. And it's the USNI?
No, it's the New for Solo.
New for, okay, gotcha.
Without doubt, the Navy's most ambitious plans for women have been in the flight training program.
We don't have video.
6 young women have been selected to pave the way for...
I'm sorry?
We don't have video.
Oh, okay. Give me a moment. I am sharing screen, correct?
Yes.
Okay, because you can see my laptop. Huh.
Mhm.
That is strange. Hold on. Let me try it again.
Without doubt, the Navy's most ambitious plans for women have been in the flight training program.
That's odd. All right, hold on just a second. I'm going to try one more thing. What I am going to embed, see if I can embed the video on my PowerPoint, and that should work. So hold on, give me a moment. Apologies. All right, let's give that a whirl. See if this plays. Does that work now? Okay.
Without doubt, the Navy's most ambitious plans for women have been in the flight training program. 6 young women have been selected to pave the way for future women in naval aviation. They are expected to perform the same as men. They go through the same classes, same drills, same exercises, and they fly the same planes. On May 10, 1973, Lieutenant Judith Ann Newfer became the first woman to solo in a Navy aircraft when she took off in a T-34 from the Naval Air Station, Saucley Field, Florida.
It was a very good feeling to know that I had actually taken that plane off and brought it back home all on my own. It was definitely a feeling of satisfaction, a feeling of having gotten over one hurdle. And I think it helped to sort of build a little confidence too, that we are in the program, we can fly the plane, and we are able to cope with the pressures and the rigorous training that we're involved in.
Our Navy's strength lies in the fact that individuals are given the chance to show what they can do. Black or white, male or female, the opportunity is there.
Okay.
Okay, so let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, can you see the cover of the book?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the book, Wings of Gold, the true story of 6 remarkable women recruited into that experimental program at the end of 1972. Against the backdrop of the women's movement and protests against the Vietnam War, a maverick chief of naval operations decided it was time women should train to fly Navy aircraft. They were not expected to succeed, and they were certainly not expected to make careers in the military. But from the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment and the end of the military draft to Tailhook, the Iraq War, and the battle to overturn the ban on women in combat, the original female naval aviators bore witness to history and made history of their own. They broke down barriers and opened doors for generations of women wanting to serve their country, and many of the challenges they've confronted are still very much in the headlines today. It's also the story of how difficult it is to turn a big ship like the Navy or any large organization, or make any kind of change. The women were thrown in basically cold, unprepared for what would be demanded of them, and many Navy men wanted them to fail. But there were also men who saw women as an untapped pool of talent deserving of the same opportunities, starting with this gentleman. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt was the youngest rear admiral and the youngest chief of naval operations in history. When he was named CNO in 1970, he knew he had a crisis on his hands. In a country rocked by the civil rights movement, the youth counterculture, and the sexual revolution, traditional norms in civilian society were giving way, but the Navy remained hidebound and rigid, and it was losing recruits in droves. The re-enlistment rate, which was normally about 35%, was down to 9.5. Zumwalt's mission was to change how the Navy did business. His method was what were known as Z-grams, Z like Zumwalt, 121 messages from the top of the chain of command directly to the fleet. One of the first stated as its goal, restoring the fun and zest of going to sea. There were Z-grams relaxing bans on civilian clothing, raising the check cashing ceiling, allowing alcohol in some barracks, and shortening the amount of time a sailor had to stand in line for anything. Z-grams addressed shore leave policies, whether Navy personnel could ride motorcycles, and what Zumwalt called demeaning or abrasive regulations, or in Navy speak, Mickey Mouse or chicken shit regs. Z-grams prohibited punishing men for growing facial hair or sideburns, and they called out racial discrimination that put non-European Navy personnel in dead-end billets to keep them from attaining high rank, barred them from Navy housing, and made harassment, disrespect, violence, and liberal use of the N-word a regular occurrence. In August 1972, Zumwalt released Z-gram 116, titled Equal Rights and Opportunities for Women in the Navy, not only because he believed equal opportunity was the right thing to do, but because it was also a potential solution to a serious personnel problem. With the Vietnam War winding down, the Navy could no longer count on men choosing to go to sea rather than fighting in the jungle. The impending end of the draft meant the Navy would have to find a way to attract volunteers. And with the expected passage of the ERA, it seemed it would soon be unconstitutional to forbid women from serving on ships, limit them to desk jobs, restrict their promotions, or bar them from most positions of command, including any job that made a woman a commanding officer over men. Z-116 could give the Navy an untapped pool of talent to draw from, prepare itself for the ERA, and begin meeting new demands of women who wanted more than the traditional careers of secretary, teacher, or librarian. One of its primary goals was assigning qualified women to the full spectrum of challenging billets. 2 months later, Navy Secretary John Warner announced that one of those challenging billets, flight training, would open to women. The idea was to find 8 female officers or officer candidates and send them through Navy flight training program at Pensacola, Florida, along with male student pilots. It was really just an experiment to see what would happen. There was no plan for how the women would manage in their first billets after flight training, or what would happen if, heaven forbid, they wanted a second billet after that one. The Navy would suspend the program after 6 months, reevaluate, and decide whether it would continue, or if the Navy would pull the plug. If the women washed out, it would be the end of women pilots in the Navy for who knew how long. And if they didn't, the women were committed to serving for 4.5 years, the only female pilots in a sea of men. Because they were split up into different squadrons almost from the start, they rarely saw one another. They would truly be alone. Of the 26 who applied, just 4 could pass the basic test called the AQT, Aviation Qualification Test, with a decent FAR, Flight Aptitude Rating. They had to have 20/20 vision without glasses, pass an IQ test, have clean personal, medical, and psychological histories, and demonstrate good hand-eye coordination. There were tests of mechanical reasoning. For example, if a picture showed a flywheel turning one way, which way was the other one turning? And of spatial perception. So if the horizon in the picture was tilted, which way is the airplane banking? These were the kinds of skills boys in the 1960s might learn working with tools in their dad's workshops or in shop class, but not a lot of girls had that kind of exposure. Only 4 women qualified, 3 commissioned officers working in desk jobs, and 1 trainee at Women's Officers School in Newport, Rhode Island. So the Navy asked recruiters to find civilians who'd want to join up. They found 4 more, and one of them would drop out before flight training began. One of the first 4 dropped out during flight training. So the Navy ended up with 6 women who would make military history. All but 1 came from military families. 2 already had pilot's licenses when they signed on, and 2 others had extensive flying experience. Only 1 had never flown before, other than as a passenger. Like their heroines, the WASP, the women Air Force service pilots who flew for the Army during World War II, they opened doors for generations of female pilots who wanted to fly for their country. And their personal stories, reflected changes in both the military and the country at large. They would become the first woman to solo a Navy aircraft, as you saw in the video, the first to fly a tactical jet, the first to command an aviation squadron, the first female hurricane hunter, the first pregnant military pilot, plaintiff in a federal class action lawsuit challenging a longstanding ban on women in combat, and tragically, the first to die in the performance of her duties. Now, before I introduce these 6 amazing women, a couple of things I wanted to note. They're often referred to as a class, but that's actually not accurate. They started at different times. They finished their training at different times, and they were split up pretty much from the start. They might have been in proximity to one or the other for a short period of time. They were never all in the same place at the same time. The other thing is about how I refer to them. I refer to the women by their first names. This really doesn't sit well with me, but I tried writing it using last names. Last names changed over time, and it just got really, really confusing. So I asked the women and their families if they thought it would be disrespectful to call them by their first names, and everyone said no, that was fine. And I refer to some of the men by their first names as well. So here are these 6 amazing women. Barbara Allen Rainey was born at Bethesda Naval Hospital, grew up in California, and was an outstanding high school and college athlete. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in physical education, she joined the Naval Reserve to follow as close as she could the path of her brother, who was a Marine helicopter pilot who served in Vietnam. She was commissioned as an ensign in December 1970 and promoted to lieutenant in March 1972. Now, at the time, there were few career options for Navy women outside the medical field, and Barb did not have a nursing degree, so she was limited to working in administration or communications. So when she heard about Warner's announcement, while serving as communications watch officer with the Supreme Allied Command Atlantic, she jumped at the chance. 2 years later, on February 22nd, 1974, retired Navy Commander Bill Allen pinned wings of gold on his daughter, America's first female naval aviator, at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas. Barb flew the C-1 Trader and the T-39 Saberliner, and was one of the first women to be part of a 2-pilot family trying to figure out how to navigate competing Navy careers. Sadly, she was killed in a crash in 1982 while working as a flight instructor at Middleton Field in Alabama. She's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. This is her official portrait, painted after she won her Wings of Gold. It's in the collection at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. Judith Neufer-Bruner, the first woman to solo a Navy aircraft, as you saw in the video, grew up around aviation. Her father flew in the Army Air Corps during World War II and managed a small airport in Ohio. Judy spent her summers answering the phone, doing odd jobs, and flying with her dad in his Piper Cub. Once during high school, an airline pilot came for career day and told her she might be a stewardess someday, but never a pilot, even though she was the only other person in the room who had ever flown. Judy soloed at 16, but aviation was expensive. And as a Star Trek fan, she wanted to become a scientist, work for NASA, and find life in outer space. But after struggling to afford college, Judy was ready to listen when an Army recruiter came to campus and offered to pay for her senior year if she enlisted. She wasn't interested in the Army, so she asked a Navy recruiter if he could match that deal, and he couldn't. But the program sounded interesting anyway, so she signed up. She spent summer between junior and senior years at Women's Officers School, and in June 1970, she graduated with a bachelor's in computer science in the morning and took her oath as an ensign in the afternoon. She was working as a computer programmer in San Diego when word went out about flight training, and it reawakened her interest in aviation. On January 10th, 1973, in a grand ceremony at the Pentagon, Navy Secretary John Warner himself signed training orders authorizing Lieutenant Junior Grade Judith Neufer as the first woman officially assigned to U.S. military flight training. And because of that, the Star Trek fan from small town Ohio got to see the world, as well as the literal eye of the hurricane, flying the P-3 Orion as the first female hurricane hunter. Later, she'd fulfill her childhood dream by joining NASA and forging a most impressive career. In 2014, she received the Catherine Bright Memorial Trophy from the National Aeronautic Association for over 40 years of distinguished and historic contributions to aviation. Jane Skiles O'Day was the daughter of a naval aviator and a Navy Reserve Supply Corps officer who both served in World War II. Her father gave her first flight in a Ford Trimotor, and they often flew together in his Beach Bonanza. But when she was in high school and applied to work the ramp at the airport where he kept his plane, the answer was no. Receptionist was the only job for a girl. Jane graduated from college with degrees in political science and music and considered going to law school. But then a friend of her dad's told her the Navy was thinking about opening flight training to women. Jane saw a recruiter and signed up. She was in the middle of officer candidate training in Newport when it became official, and she applied. The commander there cautioned her to be careful, saying the Navy does not reward pioneers. But it was a chance to follow in her father's footsteps, and if it didn't work out, she'd be able to go to law school on the GI Bill. Her mom was behind her 100%. Her dad was skeptical. But when Jane was winged in April 1974, her proud father, Paul, pinned his own wings of gold on his daughter. It was the first time she'd ever seen him wear his dress blues. Lieutenant Jane Skiles O'Day would be the first woman to fly the C-130 Hercules and the first female Navy flight instructor. Also, one of the first female naval aviators to achieve command and to make captain, the first to serve overseas, and the first ever military pilot mom. Joellen Drag Osland wanted to be a professional horse show jumper. Growing up at a time when women were not expected to be physically fit and girls' sports were pretty much non-existent, Joellen rode horses and taught swimming, horseback riding, and skiing. She had no background in aviation and no one in her family flew. But after she graduated college in December 1972 with a political science degree, her boyfriend in the reserve showed her a notice about Warner's announcement. At first, the recruiter didn't believe the Navy wanted women to fly. But when Joellen went back the next day, she passed the tests and was in. On the same day, Judy Newford became the Navy's first female flight cadet. Retired Commander Theodore Drag administered the oath of enlistment to his daughter at Naval Air Station Alameda, California. Joellen was the first civilian student naval aviator recruit and would become the first female helicopter pilot. She decorated her flight helmet with flowers. The Navy, she said, didn't quite know what to make of us anyway. She wasn't the only one. This is Janie O'Day's flight helmet at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. Now, after finding she was not allowed to land on ships with the rest of her squadron, Lieutenant Joellen Drag joined a class action lawsuit challenging limits on women's ability to serve. And she was mentioned by name in a ruling by a federal judge. She later became the first female pilot assigned aboard a Navy ship, the first female combat search and rescue helicopter aircraft commander. And later, after retiring as captain, she and her husband, Captain Dwayne Osland, became strong advocates for military women and their rights. As a side note, the Oslands made a little bit of history of their own when she was the first naval aviator to be guided in for a shipboard landing by a landing signal officer who just happened to be her husband. Anna Maria Scott was the only one of the six not from a military family. She discovered aviation as a teenager when her boyfriend and a pilot friend took her on a night flight around San Francisco. She asked her parents for flying lessons and earned both her private pilot certificate and a political science degree while at college in California. Being fluent in Spanish, she considered the diplomatic corps, but then her father told her he'd seen an article about the Navy looking for women to fly. She found a recruiter, signed on a month after Warner's announcement, and reported to Women's Officer School with the other civilian candidates in January 1973. Slightly more than a year later, Ensign Anna Maria Scott won her Wings of Gold. She would become the Navy's second female helicopter pilot, flew VIPs all over the East Coast, and secretly made some history of her own before leaving the military and flying all over the world as a pilot for FedEx. Rosemary Mariner was the last of the six to earn her Wings of Gold and perhaps the most driven, the most outspoken, and as a friend put it, the most determined to kick open doors, put in a doorstop, and tell others behind her to go through. She was also the only one clearly focused on aviation as a career. Rosemary was the daughter of a World War II Navy nurse and an Air Force captain who died in a crash near Atlanta when she was 3. 5 years later, her mother moved the family to the San Diego area. One of Rosemary's favorite pastimes when babysitting her sisters was to bring them to watch jets take off and land at Naval Air Station Miramar. By 9th grade, she decided she was going to be an airline pilot, even though there were no female airline pilots. So she cleaned houses and washed airplanes to pay for flying lessons and received her private pilot certificate at 17 while still in high school in 1970, the year Barb was commissioned. She enrolled at Purdue University, where Amelia Earhart had once been an in-house expert on women in aviation. And she was the only woman among 20 or so guys in the professional pilot program. When she was a junior, a TWA executive came to campus and told her women would never fly for the airlines. But not long after, Rosemary's mother mailed her a newspaper clipping about Warner's announcement. She found a recruiter who said she could make the cut if she graduated by January 1973. So she scrambled to finish her degree in just 2.5 years. She tested out of her remaining classes, aided by professors and university administrators, including a female dean who had served in the Navy during World War II. And she earned her bachelor's degree a week before the deadline. She was the first female graduate of Purdue's Aviation Technology Department, already having 620 hours in her logbook and certificates up to and including multi-engine instrument flight instructor. 2 weeks later, she was on her way to Women's Officer School amid a storm of publicity about the new prospective female Navy flyers. Johnny Carson, for one, talked about her by name on The Tonight Show. She was 19. It was the first step in the trailblazing career of a naval officer who was a groundbreaking Navy jet pilot, an inspiring military commander, a determined and dedicated leader, a badass pilot, as one friend described her. She logged more than 3,500 hours in 15 types of military aircraft, held a master's degree in national security strategy from the National War College, was a staff member for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and chair of the Joint Chiefs Chair in Military Strategy at the War College. Throughout her career, she worked to expand the opportunities available to Navy women, to fly increasingly sophisticated aircraft, to land on an aircraft carrier, to serve at sea, to become test pilots and astronauts, and to serve in squadrons that deployed to combat zones around the world. She was, in the words of author Deborah G. Douglas, arguably the most historically significant woman in American aviation since Amelia Earhart and Jacqueline Cochran. Amelia, everybody knows. Jackie Cochran was one of the founders of the WASP, and at the time of her death in 1980, she held more aviation records than any pilot, man or woman. So those are the first women to win Navy Wings of Gold. And here are some of the issues they had to contend with. The first was publicity. From the very beginning of the program, publicity was part of the job. Wherever they were, whatever they did, photographers were always following them around. The lure of publicity was irresistible to the Navy brass, and it added pressure to women who already had the fate of Zumwalt and Warner's experiment weighing on their shoulders, a burden that male flight cadets did not have to bear. These pictures were taken at the Pentagon press conference where John Warner signed Judy Newfer's training orders. He even brought out an enormous set of wings for the occasion. On that same day, Jo Ellen Dragg took the oath of enlistment. One story covering the event noted that her father had given her a kiss, and it was headlined, "Girl Flyer Gets Kiss, Wants Combat Too." Illustrating that was this picture of Jo Ellen wearing high-heeled boots and a miniskirt, leaning against the Beechcraft T-34 trainer. It was captioned, "Of course, the shape of things to come." Now, looking at this picture now, it's a little bit cringeworthy, and Jo Ellen's not really happy that I found it, but she totally owns it because it really speaks to the times and to the perceptions that these women had to overcome. The newspaper articles focused on their physical traits. They were blue-eyed, petite, blonde, brunette, with fetching bangs, and focused on their marital status. One reporter wanted to know what the men Jo Ellen dated thought about her flying. wrote the New York Times in January 1973, there will be no prohibition against their carrying feminine gear such as makeup in the capacious pockets of their flight suits. The writer then added that a man pilot is allowed to carry personal objects as well. Judy and Barb arrived at Pensacola early, not to get a jump on their flight training, but for PAOs, public affairs opportunities. In the photos at the bottom right, they're standing in the sand, wearing heels and white gloves on the Pensacola obstacle course in front of a wall that would soon be a literal barrier in their path. When Judy taxied out on her historic first solo, as you saw in the video, complete with air-to-air footage and a press conference, all of Softly Field froze in place. Everything came to a standstill until she landed, taxied in, shut down, and shook her CO's hand. This is a page out of Judy's logbook with solo noted toward the bottom right, and her certificate marking the occasion. Note the pronoun, his first solo. Jane is also in the video at the very beginning of the clip, being pushed off the platform into the water and dragged along. This is an exercise called parachute release, and it simulates what happens if a pilot has to ditch in the water and bail out. Eventually, the chute will get waterlogged and pull the pilot under if she can't release the harness. There's also a brief clip in the film of Barb kneeling on the wing of a T-34 holding a fuel cap in her hand. Now, parachute release wasn't the only water training. All student naval aviators had to tread water for 30 minutes and swim a mile in a pool wearing a man-sized flight suit. Some of them were so large the crotch stretched down to the women's knees. One member of a later class, who retired as a rear admiral, did her swim in a 44 long. There was also something called the Dilbert Dunker, a giant red contraption that simulated crash landing in the water. As the student sat inside, it plunged into the pool and then flipped upside down, testing the pilot's ability to escape. There were 1.5 mile runs, ejection seat training, survival training, oxygen deprivation in a hyperbaric chamber, and explosive decompression to simulate a mid-air catastrophe. For every one of these tests, the Navy wanted pictures of the women. Now, everyone hated the Dilbert Dunker, but Judy volunteered to do the Dilbert Dunker photo shoot because she knew the survival training pictures would have a snake, and she didn't want to have to hold the snake. That's Barb holding the snake, with Jane looking on. They cooked the snake and made the women take a bite. Judy said it tasted like chicken. Later, the women went on game shows in uniform. That's Lieutenant Junior Grade Judith Newfer on What's My Line with Larry Blyden. And they were featured in interviews and magazine stories. Judy was on the cover of Parade magazine, and Rosemary was one of Glamour magazine's 10 outstanding working women of 1982. A machine gun, she told the editors, is a great equalizer. Now, even if the women's commanding officers didn't necessarily want them there, and a lot of them did not, they soon realized the value of publicity. Barb and Judy were forced into a race to get their wings first because each CO wanted bragging rights to be able to say he had female naval aviator #1. After Rosemary got into fighter jet training, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, she was assigned to an attack squadron in Jacksonville, Florida, to learn to fly the A-7E Corsair II. There, the skipper, John McCain, cut her first flight short and had her recalled to the base so reporters could get the story of the lady jet fighter pilot in the next day's papers. Before Jane reported to her first billet en route to Spain, she had to learn to fly the C-130 Hercules, but the only C-130 school was run by the Air Force. Women in the Air Force at the time didn't fly. And the Air Force they didn't want a woman flying one of their Hercs, and they definitely didn't want a Navy woman flying one. But they changed their tune when they realized that Jane was a celebrity, and the press would come running to Little Rock to see the nation's one and only female C-130 pilot taxi out for a check ride. Upper body strength and bathrooms. After Barb and Judy finished up with their days-long photo shoots, the first female naval aviator candidates got down to business. First came 3 days of indoctrination and psychological and physical tests, followed by weeks of intense physical instruction. Every exercise tests physical and mental toughness to prepare future pilots for the risks and potential catastrophes of flying. The women were expected to meet the same standards as men. The women all did great in the pool and in survival training, but the walls on the obstacle course posed a problem. There were two, one 15 feet high with ropes and the other 8 feet tall that they had to hoist themselves over. Trainees had to run the obstacle course multiple times and finish in a matter of minutes. Even for many men, the walls were a huge challenge. But Judy and Jane had less upper body strength to begin with, and they went to an officer training program that emphasized administrative knowledge necessary for supporting the Navy bureaucracy, not physical conditioning needed to serve at sea or in the air. Now, Barb had been a phys ed major, and at least one of the guys in her squadron resented that she could match him sit-up for sit-up. Eventually, they got married, and John and Barb Rainey carved out complementary careers in California and in the area around the Gulf of Mexico, and they raised 2 daughters. Overall, though, the women couldn't meet the men's physical standards, so they got remedial training with pull-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, bike, rowing, and weightlifting on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and running on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's their physical workout schedule. Eventually, the Navy eliminated the wall requirement for the women and changed some of the other standards as well. It was probably one of the few times they let the women proceed when they didn't necessarily meet the requirements, because if they had kept the requirements, the Navy would have lost the entire group. But it was also a test for the Navy, which is just assumed that this kind of strength was necessary for pulling a plane out of a spin or dealing with hydraulic failure. The WASP had proven decades before that brute strength was not necessary, but that lesson had been forgotten, and it had to be learned all over again. Now, the civilian recruits who started women's officer school about a month before Judy, Barb, and Jane reported to Pensacola knew they were going to need greater arm strength, and they made sure they got physical training before they started flight school. Jo Ellen said she was particularly fortunate that she had a lot of upper body strength that came from riding horses and shoveling what comes out the back end, and that was a skill that served her well. Which brings us to the second subject in this section, bathrooms. Somehow, officers in the nation's seafaring branch couldn't deal with the fact, or didn't want to, that women might need a separate place to relieve themselves. The supposed difficulty of providing separate bathrooms for women became a common excuse for disobeying orders and not accommodating women in formerly all-male ships and other facilities. When Jane arrived in Rota, the CO told her there was only one bathroom and she wasn't allowed to use it. This is a story about Jane in Stars and Stripes. Her squadron was nicknamed the Go-Go Airline, and of course she was the Go-Go Airline girl. Actually, there were 2 bathrooms, one marked officers and one marked men. Jane decided that since she was an officer, she should use the one marked officers. And after the first time she walked in on a couple of officers because the stalls had no doors on them, the commanding officer quickly redesignated the rooms men and women. Motherhood and family. Now, until 1972, pregnancy was cause for immediate dismissal from the military. After that, a woman could request a waiver from her CO, and if he agreed, she could continue her career. So you can imagine the tumult when a woman who was told she wasn't allowed to use the bathroom became America's first pregnant military pilot. Jane's skipper assumed she would quit, but she and her husband, a crew chief maintaining the planes she flew, decided she should stay. She cobbled together civilian clothing into something that looked like a Navy uniform because there were no maternity uniforms. And by the way, there were no maternity flight suits until last summer. Jane caught lots of flack for that, even though she was perfectly acceptable under Navy regulations. A man she described as a very enlightened flight surgeon made a politically risky decision not to ground her until she and he decided it was the right thing to do for the health of her and the baby. Her male crewmates suggested she name the baby Hercules after the C-130, and one listed the unborn child as a half member of the crew. At 7 months, Jane switched to a desk job, was promoted to lieutenant senior grade 2 weeks after giving birth to a baby girl, and returned to flying about a month later. By the time she got pregnant with her second daughter, she was a flight instructor at Pensacola, and she stopped in her 6th month only because she was having trouble reaching all the buttons and switches. That baby logged over 100 hours of flight time in the T-34. Jane proved it was possible to be a naval aviator, a Navy officer, and a mom all at the same time. Now, juggling two careers wasn't so complicated for Jane and her husband, Tom, because he was an enlisted man who left the Navy when they returned stateside. But Rosemary Mariner and her husband, Tommy, were both officers and naval aviators. Usually, deciding whose career should take precedence was a major issue when both husband and wife were on active duty. But Tommy realized early on that Rosemary was unique, even though she did not want to be seen as exceptional. And he felt her career should come first. When they retired from the Navy, he held the rank of commander, and she was a captain. Still, he had opportunities she did not. And even as she became the first woman to command an aviation squadron in 1990, she acknowledged that her husband was a window into a world she herself was not allowed to see. This is from her piping on ceremony at VAQ 34, a tactical electronic warfare squadron at Naval Air Station Point Mugu, California. Equal opportunity. Well, one highlight of any naval aviator's career, the thing that made them naval aviators, was carrier qualifying, landing on a bouncing, shifting short runway on the deck of an aircraft carrier at full throttle in case you missed and had to go around, and then snagging one of 4 arresting cables with the tail hook and being jerked to a full stop in 2 seconds flat. Student naval aviators would fly out in groups of 4 to the training carrier Lexington to log their landings, called traps. 10 traps, and the aviator was a tail hooker, carrier qualified. It was a huge point of pride, the one thing that distinguished Navy pilots from all others, but the women weren't allowed. And when Lieutenant Judith Newfer, Ensign Jane Skiles, and Ensign Rosemary Conitzer, later Mariner, wrote a letter asking to be allowed carrier qualification, not only did the Navy say no, but it changed the syllabus to take carrier qualification away from some of the men as well. The Navy called it a cost-cutting measure, but it was an odd coincidence, and it did not endear the women to the men. In the eyes of many male naval aviators, the women were not meeting the same qualifications or sharing the same risks. And the women agreed with that, by the way. And many men thought they did not deserve to be called naval aviators at all. It was only one of the first time that Rosemary's training was cut short because she was not allowed to carrier qualify. The men would fly out to the carrier in whatever aircraft they were training in, and she was sent back early to her home squadron. It wasn't until 1979, 6 years after Judy, Jane, and Rosemary wrote this letter, that a female naval aviator was allowed to carrier qualify. And she had to transfer from the West Coast to the East Coast because the admiral in charge in the Pacific would not let women aboard his ships. Excuse me. And it wasn't until several years later that both Jane and Rosemary joined the crew of the Lex and carrier qualified. And Jane said doing that cat shot was the most terrifying thing she had ever done in her life. And Rosemary eventually logged 17 traps. Now, carrier qualifying was not the only shipboard duty that was off limits to women. Soon after Ensign Joellen Dragg won her wings and became the Navy's first female helicopter pilot, she found she wasn't allowed to fly out to ships with the rest of her squadron. Civilian women could go to ships, but she couldn't fly them there. She wasn't even allowed to hover over a ship to deliver the mail. This was because of a federal law, U.S. Code Title 10, Section 6015, and it said, in part, women shall not be assigned to duty in aircraft while such aircraft are engaged in combat missions. And the Navy interpreted combat mission to mean any vessel that could at some point have a combat mission, not it was that it was engaged in combat at that time. Flying to and from ships was the primary job for Navy helo pilots. Joellen was being evaluated by the same standards as her male colleagues for work she wasn't allowed to do. She couldn't log flight time she needed to advance, and the Navy was depriving itself of the services of a qualified pilot trained at great public expense. After her requests for permission to fly to ships with her squadron vanished up the chain of command, Joellen joined a federal class action lawsuit challenging the combat exclusion. And in 1978, Judge John Sirica of Watergate fame ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and mentioned Joellen specifically by name. The decision wasn't the end of the matter, but it did open the door a bit, allowing Navy women, including Jo Ellen, to serve shipboard. It was, she said, her salvo in the battle to overturn the combat exclusion, and she became the Navy's first female aviator to perform a shipboard mission. Now, besides confronting restrictions head-on, there were also ways around them. For Anna Maria Scott, the Navy's second female helo pilot, it came down to hiding in plain sight. A lieutenant commander in her detachment thought the restrictions made no sense, and he took the risk to give her the experience of landing shipboard. More than once, when landing on an aircraft carrier or a destroyer, he took her along as crew, clandestinely. She had to stay inside the helo with her visor down, so no one would know there was a woman on the ship. Only the two of them, she said, ever knew she had disobeyed the law. Now, another thing the female naval aviators were not allowed to do, at least in the beginning, was fly jets. Every flight during flight training was graded from the start of each lesson to shutdown, on everything from flying ability to ground school to situational awareness to head work, how they kept cool under pressure, dealt with distractions, and coped with emergencies. At the end of basic flight training, depending on their grades, the Navy's needs at the time, and to some degree the pilot's wishes, naval aviators would be sorted into one of three pipelines: jets, props, or helos. Jets were the sexiest and most desirable, and only pilots with the top grades got to fly them. But the women got only props or helos, like the less qualified men. Rosemary, for one, had grades good enough to qualify for the jet pipeline, but she wasn't allowed. Women didn't fly jets. But at her first billet, Rosemary's skipper saw parallels between the obstacles Black service members had to face in integrating the military and the challenges facing Rosemary and the other female naval aviators. Commander Raymond Lambert was the first Black CO at Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia. He became her mentor, a pair of firsts, and he provided a roadmap for how the women should band together, network to protect their careers and each other, and document everything that happened for the record. When Lambert needed more jet pilots, he sent a request for all his junior propeller pilots, including Rosemary, to do jet transition training. Her orders got lost. But an ex-fighter pilot up the chain of command named Chuck McGrail, who later became a rear admiral, made sure her orders got found and approved. And in 1976, Rosemary became the first woman to qualify in a fighter jet, the A-4EL Skyhawk, though, again, she wasn't allowed to carry or qualify with the guys. But by the end of the year, she became the first woman to fly a frontline light attack aircraft, the A-7E Corsair II, at McCain's squadron in Jacksonville. Here she is in an A-7 with her name on it at VAQ 34 in the early 1990s. Piping over the side. As their careers progressed, the female naval aviators had a platform for making change, not just for themselves, but for women who followed. In Rosemary's case, watching her husband on his traditional career track gave her insight into what needed to change and how to do it. She was a driving force in the battle in Congress over the combat exclusion in 1991. A full court press of military women and their supporters, including the WASP, against opponents in the Senate, including John Warner, John McCain, and John Glenn. Rosemary became a regular guest on TV news programs, op-ed writer, and go-to interviewee for news stories about anything and everything involving women and the military, from sexual harassment, which she linked closely to the combat exclusion as reinforcing women's second-class status, to the tailhook scandal, to how realistic the film G.I. Jane really was. Anna Maria had decided, as many men do, that the Navy just wasn't the right fit. So she resigned after her 4.5 years were up, but being a military-trained pilot made her an attractive job candidate. And FedEx hired her, even though she had pretty much only helicopter time, not fixed wing. She spent her career flying around the country and internationally as a FedEx pilot, eventually retiring to the south of France. But the others cycled through high-profile billets, including postings at the Pentagon and command tours, modeling what military women could do. Jane would become commander of a recruiting squadron in Indianapolis, a celebrity in her own right, hanging out with the likes of Chuck Yeager and Al Unser Jr. at the Indy 500. Eventually, she retired, piping over the side in Navy speak in 1997. That's Rosemary pictured at the top with Jane, And if you look at the photo at the bottom, this is the original picture it was taken from. This is from Navy Times from the summer of 1997. That's Jane on the left and Rosemary second from the right. Rosemary retired a few months later and joined the faculty of the University of Tennessee's Center for the Study of War and Society, where she specialized in military history and the juncture between war and conscience. She continued to write op-eds, publish articles, and be a commentator and analyst for ABC, NPR, CNN, and other outlets. Judy had left active duty in 1981 because the P-3 Orion had a combat mission in most squadrons, and her opportunities were limited. So she joined the reserves, where she had more options. She did 3 command tours and then started working at NASA, first as a computer programmer for the Hubble Space Telescope, and later as Director of Safety and Mission Assurance at the Goddard Space Flight Center. She hadn't done any computer programming in years when she applied, but her contact at NASA had also been a naval aviator, and he figured that if she could do that, she could do this. She retired from the reserves in 1998 after 28 years with the rank of captain, soon after Joelle and Osland. The first one in was the last one out. A well-deserved honor. In 2017, Women in Aviation International inducted the first female naval aviators into the Pioneer Hall of Fame. It was the first time they had ever been together as a group, with John Rainey representing his wife, Barb. As the most senior female naval aviator, Judy spoke for the group, and in a tribute video, WAI drew a direct connection between the 6 pioneers and their heroines, the WASP of World War II. 1,000 people stood up and cheered, among them some active duty female naval aviators, including combat veterans, who 2 years later, after Rosemary passed away of cancer, would fly the Navy's first ever missing man, all-female missing man flyover at her funeral. Some had met her and all knew her story and the debt they owed to the original female naval aviators. And last year, Rosemary Mariner was reinducted to WAI as an individual to the Pioneer Hall of Fame. These are the flyover F-18 pilots, and Amanda Lee at the bottom right is the Blue Angels' first female demo pilot, making her debut in a couple of weeks. So she will have made Navy history twice in 4 years. These pictures were taken at the hotel where the guests stayed for the funeral. That's Joellen at the top right and Judy next to her. And 2 in from Judy is Mary Louise Griffin, who was in the second group of female naval aviators after the program resumed. And she is a centerpiece of the female military aviator community. And she was incredibly helpful with the book. She and Judy both said, yeah, I have documents, come to my house and see my archive. And I could not have possibly written the book without her help. And at the hotel, several generations of female naval aviators honoring one of their own. So I think that's it for this couple of factoids about the book. And this is where you can find it. I will also put a link to the Amazon page in the chat. It's in hardcover and audiobook and ebook. And let me stop screen sharing. And there's one more video that Eleanor, if you could play that.
Yep, and I embedded it in my PowerPoint, so I think it should play. So give me just a moment. And
Can you turn up the audio?
that's about as good as I can get it, unfortunately.
There's no sound.
There's no sound?
Well, there wouldn't be sound at the beginning, but that intro should have
Hold on.
should
let me
have audio.
make sure. Hold on. I'll try again. Okay.
There was an email that went out from the second female jet pilot. Her name's Captain Retired Mary Louise Griffin. She was kind enough to let us all know of Captain Mariner's passing last Friday. The flyover idea came shortly after that from a group of incredible retired women aviators who had quite a few contacts, made some calls, and I think by Monday the planning was well in the works. One of the neatest things about this flyover is that of all of us sitting here today, we would not be sitting here were it not for some of the work that she did. As well, we have 2 Top Gun graduates, we've got a commanding officer, an executive officer, and combat veterans sitting here. We would not be here today without her, and none of us are firsts. She was a first, the first female jet pilot and the first commanding officer. The fact that none of us are first is really a testament to her.
I can remember in 1993, I was 15 years old, and that's when the combat exclusion was lifted, so women could fly in combat in 1993. I did not know who was behind it. I didn't know what women had been fighting for that, and I had no idea how big of an impact that policy decision was until, honestly, we put this crew together, and I was looking at all our bios, and I saw how many combat deployments we had under our belt as a group, and it was pretty awe-inspiring to think back to 26 years ago in April, the decision that was made to allow us to do what we've done now. So,
flying today's weapon systems is a continuous process of study. It takes approximately 3 years to get through flight school, and the hard work doesn't stop there. But through hard work and perseverance, you can really achieve any dream, and that's a door that Captain Mariner opened for us. So never think because you're a girl you can't do something.
We embody the work that she did because we're here and we're able to fly these aircraft together in division in tribute to her and her service and the actions that she had to undertake in order to enable us to be here. And that's where our focus really lies.
We obviously want to make it look good for Captain Mariner, and in her honor is sort of her last flight and the last testament that we can honor. We have to honor her, as all 8 combat aviators that are going to be in this flyover. It truly is kind of the last measure of what her legacy has left for us.
Okay. Well, that was great. I was sitting here intermittently with my jaw on the floor about the stories of what these women had to persevere through, and just, the magnitude of their accomplishments. So it is quite moving. I'm wondering, as a kickoff to the first question, Beverly, now the Navy, I believe, was the first of the armed forces to allow women pilots. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. The WASP, who were technically civilians, were recruited specifically to fly for the Army, or what became, there was no Air Force at the time. They were ferrying pilots, airplanes from factories to bases. They were test pilots. They were flight instructors for men who were going off to fly in combat. They towed targets for gunners to practice firing at with live ammunition. They logged something like 77 million air miles in every warplane the United States could produce. And when the guys started coming home and they weren't needed anymore, their records were sealed, their service was buried. They did not get any veterans benefits until the 1970s. Basically, when the service academies started admitting women, and the Air Force was saying, hey, we have the first, women in the military, and the WASP, they were grandmothers. They looked around and said, wait a minute, how about us? And they finally did get the recognition they deserved. But after the war, 1948, federal law eliminated the women's auxiliaries, and in theory wrapped women into the regular military, but with so many restrictions that women were not allowed to serve on an equal footing in the least. And the restrictions I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation were codified into federal law. So when Zumwalt decided he needed people, and well, they didn't have women, so it really made sense to get out ahead of what they thought was going to be a change in federal law with the ERA and lift these restrictions. He was ahead of his time, ahead of the heads of all the other branches of the military. And so when he opened flight training to women, they were the first official U.S. military female pilots. The Air Force and the Army followed suit not long after, but the Navy was out in front of that.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, before I forget, let me just put the link for the book in the
Oh,
chat.
great. Thank you. Yeah, just saw that go up. I do have another question, but before we get to that, I know there's a gentleman online this evening, Steve Merriman, who actually worked at the Naval Air Development Center in Warminster. And Steve, I don't know if you're still on. I'd love to have you comment on some of the work that you were involved in with the F-18 while you were at NADC. No, Steve, are you still on? Oh, he may have left. Okay. Well, he was going to comment that he actually was involved in some work that was done at the Naval Air Development Center on testing the, I guess, the cockpit parameters, the ejection seat and so forth, and accommodating women for the F-18.
Eleanor, are you talking about me, Steve Cloak?
No, Steve Merriman was on earlier.
Because we did the same thing in the centrifuge with women as far as taking G's. And,
Yeah,
and the new G suits.
Yeah, I was here. I was chatting with Steve during the talk about some of the work that he was involved in when he was at NADC. But and I had specifically said, said to him, I said, I think there was work done with women in the centrifuge. Because I remember Linda Frattone, I think, was one of those volunteers.
Yeah, there were about 6 of them. Yep.
Yeah. All right.
And they all handled it just fine.
Yeah. So yeah, sorry that Steve must have had to drop, but I'd like to open it up for other people with questions.
Yeah, I do have a quick excerpt that I could read if you like, or we can just do questions, whatever works for you.
Sure. Why don't we see if there's any questions, and then we could do that.
Okay.
Eleanor, I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
My comment is Amanda Lee, whose call sign is Stalin, was an instructor pilot at VFA 106 down at Oceana, and she was the F-18 Super Hornet demo pilot for 2 years prior to the Blue Angels selection. I had a chance to interview her up at an air show in Newburgh, New York, a couple years ago, and she's a very cool lady. Glad she made it to the Blue Angels. And my question is, in the beginning, the women could not carrier qual, and it seemed kind of ridiculous to have them fly Navy jets land-based. And I guess my question is, I guess they didn't do cruises if they couldn't carrier qual?
Right, they couldn't do cruises. They were strictly shore-based, and this was, one of those lingering inequalities that really made no sense, but made things very difficult because the men were supposed to be alternating between sea and shore duty, with women occupying shore billets only. It left fewer openings for the guys, so that was limiting to them, which was another source of resentment. That women weren't allowed to go to sea meant they weren't accepting the same risks. It also meant that they didn't have the same opportunities to attain experience necessary for command.
Wasn't it? It seemed kind of ridiculous that they would allow them to fly land-based, but the whole purpose of an aviator is to land on a ship.
Right.
I mean, it seems like, yeah, you can drive the car around the parking lot, but you can't take it out on the road. I mean, what's the point?
Right, exactly. And as with, ultimately flying in combat, which, finally opened up, 1993 or so, it proved to be a distinction without a difference. And whatever fears there were about, letting women do this, they came to nothing. They performed just, equally with the men. What the resistance was never a rational thing. There was this amazing exchange. In 1991, there were Senate hearings about lifting the combat exclusion. And Merrill McPeak, who was the commandant of the Air Force, said he just doesn't think that women should fly in combat. And he knows it doesn't make any sense, but that's just how he feels. And this is how military policy is made.
Yeah, there was a woman pilot that was killed off the Fantail as she was
Yep.
landing in I think it was down in the Caribbean. I could have that wrong, or the Pacific
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah, Kara
I guess that
Holtgreen.
was back in the early 90s.
Yep, yeah, Kara
Yeah.
Holtgreen. She was the first fatality, not the only one flying the F-14 to suffer the same kind of fatal accident. But of course, you know, she got all the attention.
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, I found it interesting about the Pacific commander saying we won't allow women to land on his ships. So I found I just find it interesting that you have a policy change, yet the internal resistance still persisted and was permitted, which I
Yeah.
find, really curious, but
Yeah.
maybe not unexpected, but
I mean, the women, I think, expected it, maybe not to the degree some of them experienced it, but, trying to change the culture of a branch of the military that's done things the same way for hundreds of years. Women weren't allowed on ships, period. That was codified in federal law.
mhm.
It just made no sense. And, it was very comfortable for, certain men just to kind of ignore it. Orders got lost, orders got slow walked. It was just too difficult to find a place for a women's bathroom on a ship. So sorry, can't accommodate women there.
Yeah, amazing. A lot of parallels, things that in the presentation, paralleled things that we've heard, with, like the women computers that worked at Langley, the whole Hidden Figures movie, type
Yeah.
of thing. And I also found it poignant and fascinating that the commander in Oceana, an African-American man, was the one who really helped to move things forward. That it took, someone like him to be able to do this. I just find it interesting and ironic at the same time.
Yeah, talking about, the culture shift and the leadership. One of Rosemary Mariner's interpretations of, tailhook in this horrible, 3 days of, sexual assault that was, sort of tolerated, if not encouraged by the Navy, which paid for its male aviators to go. There was a plenary session before the festivities began, with a bunch of admirals up on the dais and the room full of, mid-level officers, and a woman got up and asked when women would be allowed to fly tactical air, which, basically jets. And there were boos and catcalls, and she was shouted down from the floor, and the admirals on the dais did nothing to stop it. And that was when, the Pentagon investigation finally happened. Blame was put on a lack of leadership that tolerated this kind of behavior. These people were kind of forced out, and supposedly there were reforms to make sure that, this sort of lack of leadership didn't happen again. A couple of years ago, there was an enlisted woman at Fort Hood who complained of sexual harassment, was ignored, disappeared. Her body was found. And the Pentagon investigation blamed a lack of leadership. So, it's the same story, sort of, unfortunately, these things just recycle, they come back.
Yeah. Any other questions from the group? Well, I'd like to still have you read an excerpt, but I do want to ask you before we do that, what's next? What's your next book? What's your next thing you're looking into?
I am looking at, I don't know if it's going to happen. There's a story that I sort of hint at in Wings of Gold about some waves who served during World War II. And it might be an interesting story if I can find the information. I don't know if there's enough out there. So I've started doing some of the legwork, and I think it's going to take a lot of digging. Fortunately, unlike when I was researching this book, when the pandemic shut everything down, the archives are open and the museums are open, so I can actually go and look through and not have to, ask archivists to do my legwork for me, and they were extraordinarily generous in doing that. But this is going to take a long time just to see if the information's out there, because, you know, like the WASP, I mean, these women just went home and never talked about what they did. The stories may just have vanished.
I do have two stories I can relay to you. I can do that separately. But two women that actually worked at the Naval Air Development Center were waves, but it's what I think their work during that time and then when they were at NADC is quite fascinating. So I'll send you a separate email on that.
I'd like to hear about that. Yeah, one thing I can say about it, these women were flying. They were not pilots, but they were flying.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping I can hoping I can find them.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, why don't we have you go ahead and read the excerpt from your book?
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of chapter 7, which is called Owens v. Brown. For 2 glorious days in 1974, Interior Communications electrician 2nd class Yona Owens was a full-fledged member of the crew of the survey ship USNS Michelson. No men in her specialty were available, and orders approving her for sea duty on the non-combat vessel were signed and sealed, until they were rescinded by the Judge Advocate General as a violation of federal law. Under Section 6015, Navy women were not allowed to serve on ships, though civilian scientists and technicians and Army and Air Force women were all permitted to travel and work on board. Frustrated at the restrictions that stymied her career, Owens had begun networking. A letter she published in Navy Times offering to share research on women's rights yielded 312 requests for help. Yeoman Suzanne Holtman was a staffer in a new personnel office for enlisted women. The two connected, and with 2 other enlisted women, aided by the American Civil Liberties Union and the League of Women Voters Educational Fund, they decided to file a class action lawsuit against the federal government, charging discrimination on behalf of 21,870 Navy women. The defendants, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown and Secretary of the Navy W. Graham Claytor. At the same time, Lieutenant Joellen Dragg was chafing under the limits Section 6015 placed on her ability to do her job. She wasn't allowed to hover her helicopter over a ship. Civilian women could go on ships, but she couldn't fly them there. There were always mechanical problems with the blades on the CH-46 Sea Knight helicopter, so much of the fleet was frequently grounded. This made it difficult for her to log hours and meet other qualifications to advance, even in shore-based billets. Joellen wasn't the only officer in San Diego who thought it was time to bring the rules up to date. While she was pursuing administrative remedies and writing letters up the chain of command, others were also questioning why Section 6015 still existed. Among these was Lieutenant Suzanne Riddlehoover, who was studying at night to become a lawyer. Also, Lieutenant Commander Kathleen Byerly, a women's officer school graduate, and coincidentally, one of Time Magazine's 12 Women of the Year in January 1976, along with former First Lady Betty Ford and tennis superstar Billie Jean King. The 3 officers asked Riddlehoover's constitutional law professor for help, and in researching Section 6015, they discovered the class action suit already in the works. With her requests denied and her career stalling, Joellen sent one more letter, assisted by a JAG attorney at her wing and endorsed by her commanding officer. The letter went up the chain of command and vanished. Joellen says she suspects one of the Navy brass was dead set against the idea of female military pilots, and that another, scarred by his experiences in Vietnam, could not square those horrific memories with the idea of women as prisoners of war. So the 3 female officers joined the 4 enlisted women in pursuing the only remaining course of action, a judicial appeal. Joellen didn't have to testify, and life went on as usual. Most of the men in her squadron didn't even know there was a lawsuit, let alone that she was the named plaintiff. But on July 27, 1978, Judge John Sirica ruled Section 6015 unconstitutional, and his opinion addressed Joellen specifically by name. The Navy saw there was no argument left and declined to appeal. 3 months later, the Defense Authorization Bill amended Section 6015, leaving severe limitations in place, but it redefined the role of female aviators and allowed them for the first time to land on ships at sea. For the first time in Joellen Dragg's career and in Navy history, a female helo pilot would be assigned to duty aboard a Navy ship. The ship was the Vancouver, and the assignment was a 6-day military exercise 300 miles off the California coast. Flying out and landing, the only woman within miles, Joellen was tasked with retrieving remote-controlled drones launched from the ships in the exercise. Measuring 8 to 10 feet long and looking like miniature orange airplanes, the drones simulated enemy aircraft for ships and planes to shoot at. Eventually, they would ditch in the ocean, and the helos would fly over to retrieve them one at a time. A crew member sitting in the doorway, dangling 10 feet above the ocean, would snag the drone with a long pole and then attach it to a cargo hook in the floor. There were dangers. If the drone was at the wrong angle of attack, it could start flying on its own underneath the helo and cause serious damage. A chopper that hovered too low could suck ocean water spray into the engine intakes, collect salt on the turbines, and stall. That's what happened to the second helo in the exercise. The crew couldn't restart the engine and the chopper flipped over in the sea. Joellen flew over to rescue the second helo's 5 crew members and return them to the ship. After recovering the rest of the targets and landing again, she wandered towards sickbay to see if the other crew members were all right. Suddenly, a sailor jumped out and saluted and said, "I owe you an apology, ma'am." The sailors had been on the signal bridge when the helo went in the water, and they'd all bet that she was the pilot who was flying. They'd let the woman touch the controls, and she'd crashed. For the next 3 or 4 days, with the second helo crew grounded until the accident investigation was over, she and the other remaining male pilot had to do all the flying. More than once, hovering near the ship, she caught sailors taking pictures of the lady helo pilot recovering targets.
Wow. Amazing. Well, I think that's a fitting end to this evening. So again, Beverly, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. Lots of wonderful accolades in the chat, and I will share those with you afterwards when I upload this this file. But again, thanks again. Really would
Well,
encourage you to write that next book. So we'll be looking for that, and we'll have you back so we
Okay.
can
Well,
talk about the wave.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you in March. All right. Thank you. Good night.